tables. It's like church. There's some seats down in front. Will be basking in the Holy Spirit? We are going to church, by the way. Yeah, so plenty of easily accessible seats in the first 2 rows.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for sticking around for our afternoon day 2 session. And I'd like to just say thank you to everyone for supporting and attending the conference, and we couldn't be here without you. And with that, I am Carrie Shikarjian, co-chair with Mike Johnson of the Planning Committee, and I am going to turn it over to Mike to talk about the rest of the day events.
Thanks, Carrie. Just a couple minutes here. The first thing, we have what we call the Career Development Academy this afternoon. So please, if you get a chance to go upstairs to the Cable TNT, what we call the TNT, Cable Today and Tomorrow room, and participate in the Ask a Professional roundtable discussions. And then after that, there'll be a mock interview, an opportunity for you to sign up to do a mock interviews if you're interested in such things. That is, let's see, the discussions are at 2 p.m. and the mock interviews are at 3:15. And thanks very much to the University of Denver for sponsoring the Career Development Academy. And don't forget, after the keynote, we also have one more session of technical presentations that from 2 to 3:30 p.m. And I encourage you to go see those as well. So we'll go back to Carrie. She'll introduce our keynote today.
We're excited to have Brian Timoney with us, owner of the Timoney Group and a 15-year Colorado geospatial veteran. Has wide experience in GIS and web mapping in sectors such as defense, oil and gas, and local government. An ongoing promoter of the local technology scene, he has founded and organized conferences, co-hosts the Denver Geospatial Amateurs Monthly Gathering, and opines on a broad range of industry issues at the mapbrief.com blog as well as on Twitter. Please welcome Brian Timoney.
Okay, before we get started, I want everyone to give the organizing committee a round of applause for putting this thing together. Part of it's selfish recognition because we're all getting paid the same to be here and to participate today. So when I was asked to be the keynote speaker, I said, great. And then they came back, you'll be doing day 2. Now, as a conference, somebody who attends tech conferences, my ability to absorb technical information decreases significantly by about 2:30 on day 1. So, this talk will go in a somewhat different direction in how we think about technology and mapping, and so I can only ask you to bear with me. And I want to thank the organizing committee again for when Kerry asked, hey, what's the title of your talk? I said, Mapping Ourselves into Oblivion. And she said, great. And I'm like, really? Okay, well, you'll be the judge of that. So as the introduction said, this is kind of where you find me both online and in real life. I would only ask for those of you in the Denver area that are interested in kind of periodic informal gatherings of geospatial professionals to definitely check out our meetup group, the Geospatial Amateurs, not to be confused with geospatial professionals. But we've had that group going for 2.5 years, and it's socializing and networking for geospatial professionals who are good at neither. So bring all your nerdy introversion, and you'll feel right at home. So, like many of you, I've been part of this conference over the years, in and out, and the thing we love about GIS is no one's in it for the money. the most frustrating thing about GIS, no one's in it for the money. There is no money. But what we're animated in terms of not only professional connections and kind of the general enthusiasm for technology, what really animates most of us in this industry is the ability to use technology as an enabler of spreading geographic knowledge, geographic appreciation, et cetera. And one of the themes of the talk is, have we reached that crossroads today of technology as an enabler of spatial awareness, spatial appreciation, and technology as a potential obstacle to the same? So that's where the glass half full Oblivion comes in. I started out somewhere in this time frame, and I remember the first GIS course I took was at the University of New Mexico in 1995. And the professor, El Lobo's in the house? There you go. Albuquerque. Now everyone thinks Albuquerque's a cool city after Breaking Bad. It's as weird as the show portrays it to be. That's the only thing I could tell you. But the enthusiasm for my first professor had for GIS, he says, all that grunt work, all that tedious work with data that you have to do back at the office, GIS is going to let us spend more time in the field. Okay, so the guy wasn't Nostradamus. He didn't see that we'd become database administrators, Linux system analysts, and all the things that we've morphed into and become ever more tethered to our cubicles. So that prediction didn't work out, and yet I thought that optimism of somehow connecting our daily work with technology with a much more elemental sense and appreciation of the spatial environment around us, I think that connection, again, can get a little tenuous as we, large format plotters and databases and other things constitute the daily aggravations in our life. Now, over Labor Day weekend, I was in Los Angeles, and my friend made it clear Waze, which is the traffic navigation app, Waze is now required equipment in Los Angeles. You do not leave home without Waze. And as the guy on the bottom of this Twitter conversation says, whenever I doubt Waze, the traffic gods smite me. So you do not use your independent judgment when Waze is telling you to take a detour. And so it's this kind of contradiction, shall we say, of moving through the landscapes at the beck and call of our phone app and the voice emanating from it. But I think this dependence of Waze, this Stockholm syndrome that seems to have cropped up around Waze, especially in busier cities, is telling. And of course, those of you who are familiar with Los Angeles, one of the things that makes it so unique is the topography. And the topography is the demography. The hills, certain people live in the hills, certain people live in the valley, certain people live near the beach. And so there is somewhere where geography meets topography meets demography, and you dare not leave the house without Waze. So that's my paid endorsement of Waze. My experience with GPS goes back a little further. So in 1993, I was a sergeant in the United States Marine Corps in the infantry, and I was deemed not qualified to hold a precious GPS unit. So you have to consider what else I had on my Humvee at the time. I had an anti-tank missile launcher. I had machine guns, I had rifles, I had pistols. But a GPS? No GPS for you, that's too valuable. The point of it is, for those of you on the young side, GPS has not always been a ubiquitous and inexpensive technology. And so there I was with my trusty topo map and compass, doing it the old school way, uphill in both directions. Now, what's fascinating to me is we can't talk about GPS without talking about Albert Einstein, because GPS does not work unless it incorporates both Einstein's general theory of relativity and also the special theory of relativity. Because GPS, of course, is a network of satellites far, far away, orbiting the Earth, and the way they interact with the Earth, the distances, and GPS is all about synchronized time clocks. And those of us on Earth with a receiver are taking those timestamps from the satellite, and by computing the difference in the timestamps and the known orbits of the satellite, we can calculate a very precise location. But without Einstein, there's no GPS. Indeed, without Einstein, GPS would become inaccurate within 2 minutes, and it would accrue 10 kilometers of spatial error every day, accumulate. So that is worse than your worst datum projection mistake. On the other end of human cognitive accomplishment, I give you Japanese tourists who drove in the Pacific Ocean because they were following their GPS. Now I had a choice. I could talk about the woman in Park City who got hit by cars crossing a 4-lane highway and sued Google Maps for giving her bad pedestrian directions. But the idea that we are offloading some of our basic cognitive abilities to technology, that now has its own own Googleable phrase called death by GPS. So in the most predictable sequence of slides, this is the guy who they named Darwin Awards after. And the thing about Darwin is, of course, our ideas of evolution are only somehow generally vaguely aligned. And what I want to talk today is thinking about our own human evolution in terms of we naturally assume evolution, we're always evolving to become better, to become more awesome human beings. But evolution doesn't necessarily have to work that way. And we can talk about the most notorious example of the tailbone. Those of you who've had a bruised tailbone, perhaps from going down a Black Diamond slope at Arapahoe Basin that you had no business going down, you know that's many years later you have bad memories. But the idea of we have as humans all these vestigial qualities and elements to our body which don't seem to serve any particular useful function. So at the end of the 1800s, a guy published a list of, here's 86 human organs that don't have any seemingly useful function, including the pineal gland, which actually regulates circadian rhythms. The pituitary gland, he considered a useless vestige. That is key in hormone regulation. So even our understanding of our human bodies not complete enough to have complete confidence in what are useful traits and what are truly useless traits. So with evolution, and including us being here at the present, we're entitled, or we fall into the trap of, a certain arrogance just because we're the only ones here. Now, another example I use of human capability, talk about memorization. Your grandparents and great-grandparents had an ability to memorize information that most of us can't. And the idea of Those of you who are over 40, you can remember your childhood friend's phone number. And if you're really old, that phone number starts with letters. And I was talking to a colleague the other day. She's like, I don't even know my husband's phone number. He's just Dave in my iPhone. I didn't comment on what I thought that meant for the success of her marriage, but whatever. And then in education, rote memorization. And again, getting back to my Marine Corps experience, where in boot camp, rote memorization suddenly comes rushing back. So here we are 25 years later. Sir, the 4 life-saving steps are: restore the breathing, stop the bleeding, protect the wound, treat for shock. That is now embedded after 25 years, and that is a piece of information I will go to my grave knowing. But it also begs the question, why do I need to know X if we have Google? Now, I was told we have high school students here in the audience today. So why do you need to know X in the age of Google? Well, if you're trying to save somebody's life, sometimes those four life-saving steps, the Wi-Fi is not too great. So you'll want to know that right offhand. And in a larger sense, there is a other element of memorization of how facts marinate in our brains and somehow to form knowledge. And this, in terms of the deeply philosophical piece of how our selves kind of develop over time. A most famous example, of course, is Abraham Lincoln, who famously, as a teenager, only had access to 2 books, the Bible and Shakespeare's collected works. And so 40 years later, when he composes the Gettysburg Address, so much of the rhythm, so many of the allusions come from that study of the Bible that he'd been pondering for 40 years, that he first embarked upon as a teenager. So in terms of how our memory works and how our memory works over time, there are some very subtle pathways that aren't accommodated or aren't touched upon with our default preference for Google to look up mere facts. For us in the spatial business, of course, that has a deeper analog. How do I know? Why do I need to know where anything is? Because we have Google Maps. So in some sense, this is the 25th anniversary of 29th anniversary of GIS in the Rockies. And it's like, okay, like we won. Everyone has a phone with a really detailed map of the whole world with on-demand directions in their pocket. Like, let's just go home and figure out some other human problem to conquer. And we're laughing because we know, like, okay, some problems have been solved, other problems are still very thorny. And so many of these victories of technology turn out to be Pyrrhic victories, where we have a victory with cost that turn out to be much greater than what we originally anticipated. But again, I want to make this a glass half full. So despite the presence of high schoolers who are learning and embracing technology, everyone in this room today will always have a job because of 2 things. You know that a shapefile is actually more than one file. And you're aware of the existence of map projections. Those 2 things will take us to retirement. Thank you very much. So this reference of memory was very deliberate. Memory resides in the hippocampus. And we're going to take the talk now inside to our skulls and cover some recent research which shows that the hippocampus, not only the repository of memory, but also the repository of our spatial capabilities and how they're intertwined. And I think once we start appreciating these interconnections, this story of spatial awareness and technology becomes a lot more complicated. When I saw this headline last winter, this is what planted the seed for the talk today. That after a 10-year hiatus, the U.S. Naval Academy was reinstituting celestial navigation. And the reason, well, one of the reasons being the admirals concluded that there was too much of a dependence on GPS technology and power and connectivity on the high seas, but also the issue of that GPS signal that comes down to your receiver or your phone is actually a very weak signal and can be overrode or jammed by third parties. And now there's GPS spoofers to feed you wrong locations into your GPS because they can mimic the signals coming from the satellite. So one step forward, one step back. And this is the marine sextant. And of course, long distance navigation over the featureless seas is one of the signal accomplishments of not only the human brain, but also human courage, human ingenuity, human greed, a little bit of human stupidity. But that story, that signal achievement in navigation has certainly molded destinies for centuries, including the ancestral destinies of most of us sitting here. And so the sextant, that's what measures the angle from the horizon up to your celestial body of choice, moon, sun, stars, etc. Don't worry, there's no trigonometry coming. You won't be tested. But along with that is another piece of gear that has always been with us, the ephemeris. Those of you who are Latin speakers, all two of you, you'll recognize the word root ephemeral in the ephemeris. And those were tables of the relative locations of celestial bodies, stars, planets, the moon, and the sun. And this actually goes way back to the Babylonians, and not necessarily for navigation, because what is more important to humans than mere navigation? Horoscopes. So you wanted your tables so you could develop your horoscopes. But with our Copernican, once we figured out the Earth revolved around the sun, we could develop more accurate ephemeris. And then the other issue was, it was Kepler who discovered the elliptical paths of travel of the planets that created this ephemeris. And it was accurate to 1/60th of a degree if you were using it for navigation purposes. So consider this kind of like this first spatial API, where you had your days, you had locations of where things were going to be, and you could calculate your relative location to known locations and infer your own location. So the first spatial API. Many of you are familiar with this bestseller from the author Dava Sobel, Longitude, because we were very good at figuring out latitude. Longitude was a much harder nut to crack. And the book is really good because it shows in the 1700s this intellectual conflict between the scientific purists who wanted a celestial solution to the problem of longitude, and the more pragmatic craftsman solution of building a timekeeping device. And that, of course, was what carried the day, was the sea clock developed by William Harrison. And another interesting piece of the puzzle is, because he was a mere craftsman, the British Parliament didn't necessarily want to pay him the prize money that went with coming up with a reliable method of calculating longitude. And it was our King George III, the madness of King George, who urged him and supported him in his petition to get paid by Parliament. Now, as GIS people, I know we're all fine Americans here. I don't want to doubt anyone's patriotism, but let history reflect. King George III was one of those geography-positive monarchs of the past few centuries, a cartophiliac, if you will, and he had a large collection of maps with which he was fascinated and absorbed with. So let's correct the historical record on King George III while we're talking about him. But of course, in other parts of the world, navigation didn't have the ephemeris, the sextant, and other navigation instruments. And for 2,000 years, the folks in the Pacific, the Marshall Islands, were navigating vast distances in the Pacific Ocean without any of these instruments. So recent efforts to discover what were these techniques. And it had to do with wave detection, how they thought about how they could detect direction of waves with the wind, their own bearing. And it was kind of half dead reckoning and half kind of shamanistic, subtle awareness of wave movements. And this article in particular, I won't spoil the plot, sought to figure out via science exactly how these navigation techniques were so accurate. And it's a good tale, and I urge you to look it up. Many of you are also familiar with the 1987 book, The Songlines by Bruce Chatwin, kind of a geography grad school staple. And there it was explored the concept of Aboriginal navigation in Australia. So the idea of singing songs that had actual landmarks in the songs, and you're navigating through the landscape, and if you get your verses in the correct order, then you can navigate from feature to feature. So I, of course, as a product of the late 20th century, the only thing I came up with was I drove the Chevy to the levee, and the levee was dry. So for the high school folks in the audience, that is what's called collective memory and shared culture. But do not use that for navigational purposes. And a recent book, and this is kind of the power of Twitter. We were tweeting out some things along this line, and the guy's like, oh no, you got to read this book called Making Space by Jennifer Groh. She's a professor at Duke University, and she weaves together from like the neuroscience level how these interactions of spatial awareness and memory intermingle. And the idea of space and memory are a two-way street that are mutually reinforcing. And so this is compelling to anyone who works in maps and navigation. So for instance, in a very basic sense, the person driving the car remembers so much more about the landscape than a mere passenger in the car. As you'll learn anytime you take a niece and nephew in their hometown and ask them to navigate you back home, how was I supposed to know? I'm never paying attention. And the idea of just that difference in awareness from driver to passenger has important impacts on retention of spatial knowledge. And so many of our navigational experiments, of course, happen with mice. So, we've been talking about LiDAR scans, creating maps, the sweep satellite cameras that sweep back and forth to create a map. Well, mice do the same thing by running around in kind of complicated patterns. Well, it turns out their cognitive map inside their head is mapping the topology of the space they're exploring. And the key takeaway is that the pattern inside their brain is one made up of a network of hexagons. Now, those of you who are into cutting-edge cartography, you too have also embraced hexagons. Those of you who don't currently practice hexagon choropleth mapping, I can only say your brain space compares unfavorably with that of the average mouse. That's the GIS portion of this talk. We see this idea of spatial knowledge in the hippocampus. The London taxi drivers have traditionally had to pass a rigorous test, which was basically memorizing the road network of London. And they did brain scans, and the idea of the successful test takers and the successful taxi drivers, their brains, as the headline says, literally grow on the job. Now, you know how this story ends, right? Satellite navigation, phone navigation, et cetera, now there are calls to abolish the test because we have technology. And we also have neurological proof of how this knowledge affects the brain power. So kind of, again, the contradiction, the impasse of where we are today. Now, one of the big points of the book is our sense of space is multisensory. So our ears, only so far apart, can detect sound differences, sound arriving in our ears in one ear before the other, down to 1/100,000th of a second. So just as GPS takes those timestamps and infers location by timestamps, we're able to take in sound, and the difference of when the sound hits one ear versus the other, that's how we infer distance. Now, barn owls, one ear is up, one ear is down, so they can calculate vertical distance much more accurately than we can. Don't try that at home. And then there's, of course, bats. And bats emit sound, and they're taking the reflections of the sound to calculate space. So you can crisscross wires across a dark barn, and bats can navigate through them because the sound waves bouncing back are telling them exactly the layout. So there's these amazing spatial calculation algorithms, if you will, inside the brain that let us calculate. And for us humans, it's balance, it's vision, it's the sense of touch, all go into our ability to calculate space. Now, this is a little bit of a sidebar, but I couldn't resist. So one of the ways we calculate distance is we have a kind of default sense of how long our gait is. So when we take steps, how far distance we're traveling. Turns out ants navigate the same way. Kind of, they have a sense of how many steps they took. So one experimenter attached little sticks to the ant legs, so that would mess up the distance they traveled, and they ended up getting very lost on their way home. So the idea of even the ants can have their spatial brain mechanisms easily jammed by sadistic professors at elite universities. And of course, all of this harkens back to our hunting and gathering past, where so much of survival was predicated upon our ability to understand the space around us and return to similar spots over and over again. Now, for those of us who have had loved ones with dementia or other types of brain diseases, the idea of spatial capability and wrapped up in memory issues is somewhat familiar. And this is actually the most fascinating experiment I'm going to present to you today. This is the main Plaza Milan, Italy. So it was a survey of Italians from the region who were all familiar with the plaza, but had some sort of head injury or head trauma. And typically, they asked them to say, you're facing the cathedral straight on, tell us what you would see. And if the right side of their brain was injured, they could describe everything to their right, but had trouble with everything to their left. So there was a spatial topology of the actual geography being mapped to their brain. But this is the trippy part. They asked them to imagine themselves at a different point in the plaza. And again, doing another perspective, their brain injury was on their left, and they couldn't see much on their right, but they could describe exactly what was on the left side. So the idea, they were now recognizing objects they couldn't detect in the original perspective just by imagining themselves at a different location in the plaza. So it's a deeply fascinating example of the real world getting mapped topologically inside our brain. And then we can look at this from the reverse with the concept of the memory palace. Now, if you're not familiar with the memory palace, it is a way to memorize a large number of facts. And it goes back to the ancient Greeks and Romans, and up through the current day via YouTube videos, which will tell you how to create your own memory palace to memorize facts. But it's a way of thinking about a space and assigning particular points of information to particular rooms. So you can make your way through an imaginary landscape and recall vast amounts of information. So it's artificially mapping facts, but again, harnessing that ability to relate memory and location. And so this is kind of the takeaway of the topology of the physical world and the topology of the brain that includes memory. And so when we talk about offloading the cognitive load, so to speak, of navigating in our world with computational aids, smartphones, etc., we got to be careful about lightening the cognitive load to the extent where we're harming our cognitive functions. Now on the right, I talked about the spatial location as a multisensory calculation by the brain. So I was good because I, for one, get very enthusiastic when academic research reinforces my own prejudices. So people who are running or skiing or biking who have earbuds in, the ability of blocking out one of your main senses that helps you move and understand the world around you, that's now a bad idea. But that's my next talk. I'll be having my anti-earbud rant after the conference. Just see me and we'll get a location for that. So the idea of the cognitive load and what that means for our greater spatial awareness. And this also has serious implications for how are we going to teach spatial recognition, spatial awareness, geographic knowledge. Again, going back to the many years of the GIS conference, we've always looked at GIS as being a multiplier, an enabler of teaching geography in different ways, in powerful ways. And I once sat next to a guy on a plane who was a teacher in an international school in Bogota, Colombia. So private school, pretty well-off students from well-off families. And so one day he took them out with a topographic map, and Bogota has pretty gnarly topography. And so he laid out the map and asked his students to orient the map correctly from where they were standing. And he said what was fascinating was the kids were paralyzed. They could barely calculate what was going on. And there was this is fourth grade, a fourth grade girl who didn't say boo in class. And she stepped forward and oriented the map correctly right away. So she had a spatial sensibility, a spatial knowledge that no one knew to that point that she had any special knowledge at all. So of course he doubled down, and not only topographic maps, we're going to test you on bird calls. So that's when the kids throw up the flag. You're not allowed to test us on bird calls. It's not reading or arithmetic. And he said, and his thing was, we're teaching an awareness of the world around you and a sensitivity and an ability to calculate those sounds into something meaningful. And I wonder if that's going to be the elite education of the future, rather than giving every kid a tablet and saying, here's how you get to google.com. Now, when we think about spatial technology, of course, the Oculus and virtual reality, the ability to immerse ourselves in different landscapes. And there's actually some very fascinating preliminary research on PTSD and using virtual reality to address so many of those issues. And actually taking the sufferers of PTSD back to the landscapes of warfare. And the idea of the stress, the fear, the sense, the visceral physical sense of danger, and having them more deeply associate all those feelings with those landscapes. And the hope is it would enable them to then, in their landscape of, quote, back home, to be able to better discern, their brain better discern a safe landscape from the landscapes of war, where all these feelings and brain functions were operated in a much different way. So in terms of technology being kind of all good, all bad, all helpful, all useless, there are some compelling potential use cases for the emerging technology that we see out there right now. So I want to conclude with a story. And this story starts in India in the late 1980s. And a 5-year-old boy is out with his brother and they get separated. The 5-year-old boy ends up on a train, falls asleep, and finds himself in Calcutta, unable to write, unable to read, and unable to really communicate where he came from. And he ends up in an orphanage and is soon adopted by a couple from Australia. 20 years later, and this is the guy, as a young man with a university degree, he discovers Google Earth. And trying to piece together what he remembers of home in India, he remembers a train station, a dam, a fountain, an industrial tank, and a bridge. And he spends on and off for 3 years, some hours looking at Google Earth, trying to find if there are any clues in Google Earth. And he kind of drops it. And then he has a girlfriend who has a broadband connection. And now he takes up the search in earnest, calculating how long he was asleep, how much distance, the buffer from Calcutta to where his possible hometown could have been, calculating what regions in that buffer were Hindi and what were Muslim, I believe. And so he's up all hours of the night, 3 to 5 hours at a stretch, searching, following train tracks in Google Earth. And one night at 1 a.m., he finds the railroad station, the industrial tank, and the bridge. And then he traces a route back to a nearby village with a fountain in the middle. And that's the theme of today's talk. Where we've been is who we are. Our spatial awareness builds a self-awareness of where we fit in the bewildering world. A mapping app can get us from point A to point B, but those won't plant the seeds of memory necessary for us to help travel those roads back to our core self. Thank you very much.
In appreciation of having Brian as a keynote, we'd like to give him a little cap. Thank you very much.
I don't want to count all this cash in front of you. So it's break time, and I urge you to leave quickly so I can leave through the back.
So I just wanted to give another shout out to everybody. Thank you for attending, and to let you also know that we'll be sending out a survey in a couple weeks, and in that survey we are looking for people who are interested in the planning committee. So if you have any interest at all, please check that box and we'll get a hold of you. Thank you very much.